In this lovely winter sun, I've got some quite strong shadows coming across my paper, so I'm just going to have to live with that, I think. I'm just going to try and draw some primroses. It's quite a long time since I drew flowers, actually. I used to draw flowers all the time, but then I started working more thematically, and they didn't really fit into my themes. So, but I've recently sort of craved painting them again. So here goes for primroses. So I'm just going to start by mapping them out. I've got an image of primroses here which I'll share in the description, and I'm going to be a bit selective. I'm not going to paint the whole image. I'm just going to select out a few flowers. I used to get really worried about the accuracy of my drawings. Somewhere in my mind, I think I used to think that somebody would one day call me out that it wasn't accurate enough, but even though you'll have access to this image, I don't think it's a massive crime if I don't draw it in exactly the same way these days. As I say, I used to think it was a massive issue. Strange how our minds work. I'm almost doing this as a continuous line drawing. I'm trying to draw it quite lightly because I might actually take some of it away if I don't feel that it fits with the composition. Compositions tend to work better when there's an odd number of flowers. Now putting this one, and I've actually placed that petal a little bit farther down than it should be, so I'm just going to move that. So I'm not going to get too wrapped up in the accuracy. For the composition, I think it will work better if it's just a slight bit higher, because it sort of touches that flower there. I usually find I avoid drawing groups of things as well, because drawing groups of things is always much more difficult. For me, anyway. Getting the proportions, the relative proportions, so that they look right. This petal here is foreshortened, which makes it look a little bit weird actually in a drawing. It doesn't look weird on the image, but when you come to draw it, it looks a bit strange. I'm just going to make it a little bit rounder so that it's more obvious that it's shortened. And then I'm going to reduce the size of that one a little bit. I think it's probably, I've drawn this a little bit too big anyway. Whilst if I was doing a scientific illustration, it would be really important that I got these things right, but these are just illustrations for my newsletter. So they are a representation of a primrose, but they don't have to be too accurate. They're just quite a lemony yellow, this part of the flower. Just trying to flood this colour into them. And I'm allowing it it to be denser in some areas, lighter in others. And usually I'm probably going to add a background last to this. Just some suggestion of the leaves. I'm not even too sure about that particular flower actually. Had I not already started painting yet? I'll actually try and remove it. It's just not really adding anything. Because I have now wetted, it's going to be difficult to remove entirely, but I'm not going to paint it. So I'm going to have to leave this to dry, but just before I do, I'm just going to add a bit of yellow ochre to those centres and allow it to sort of flood out a little bit. Just while the paint's wet. I'm going to leave that to dry. I've managed to erase that particular flower that I didn't like very much. I had it in my head that I wanted an odd number of flowers. Because this is a digital, going to be part of my newsletter, it doesn't really matter that it's off centre either. So part of the reason I was adding more flowers was to make it more central, but I've now decided that that isn't important to me. So what I'm going to do is start to add, because the flowers are pretty much dry, I'm going to start to add, this is sap green, a little bit of background which will suggest leaves. I'm going to add more colour into this once I've got it on, before it dries. Some lovely winter sun coming through the window here at the moment, but it's creating quite deep shadows, so I apologise for that, whilst enjoying the sun. I'm trying to be as loose as I can with it, not being too accurate about the edges of the flowers, acknowledging them, but not being too rigid and getting right up to them, or not going over them a little bit. That's fine. Primroses used to be one of my favourite flowers to paint, actually. and I'm just going to soften and bleed this out now with a larger brush. Just to suggest the green leaves that these, I can't see them in the image, but they will have been sat around them. So backgrounds of my newsletter don't always go together, so I'm making this as big as possible because I always have a white background to my newsletter, so I don't really have to cut a shaped image if it doesn't bleed to white, sort of thing. Now I'm just going to drop some darker greens whilst this is still wet. I hope you can tell that I always use my paint very wet. The paper that I'm using is always the same paper. It's a 220 GSM cartridge paper, so it will take quite a lot of wet. I don't like watercolour paper. I don't like the texture of it particularly. I have used it in the past, but I just don't particularly enjoy using it. I always find that watercolours dry much paler. I'm just trying to create that sort of out of focus foliage effect here. Allowing the paint to sort of just bleed. The different tones of the green that I'm adding to just bleed into each other. Trying to make them fairly random, then bringing some water back in. And then leaving it dry for an extended period of time, I think. I probably could add the centres of these flowers actually, because they're just quite dark green. There's just a little bit of light in the centre where I suppose it's a stamen. Comes out. I really need to read up on my flower anatomy so that I can speak about it more eloquently. Oops. My desk mustn't be quite level because it seems to be bleeding in the wrong direction. I have to probably move a little bit of that with my tissue. It's a little bit too wet. Okay, I'll leave that to dry. I'll come back to it. I'm now just going to finish off my primroses, which are almost dry, with my Pitt oil-based pencil, which is an extra soft one. And I'm just going to add some line detail just to redefine some of the areas lost in the watercolour. Not going over every single line that I've drawn, just redefining some of the more intricate details. From a nature journaling perspective, it's always good, I think, to note things, to notice. I think part of the reason for nature journaling isn't necessarily to discover anything new for the world, but it is to discover things that are new to you. So noticing things like the centre of these flowers isn't round. It's actually, it's got angles to it. But just generally noticing whilst you're painting, it's really valuable, I think, for yourself to just notice the things that you wouldn't see if you hadn't been drawing it. Might just suggest some leaves here as well. So there we go. My first flower painting in probably 20 years.